This video contains elements that are not suitable for children under the age of 14. Viewer discretion is advised.
Do you know what?
Asked Percy.
What?
Grunted Gordon.
Do you know what?
Silly.
Said Gordon.
Of course I don't know what, if you don't tell me what is.
We're just about to start the second episode of Sodorama.
Rubbish!
Said James.
Sorry, James, but that's no rubbish we're talking about here. We are indeed continuing with Sodorama, with what many people consider to be the best season not only of the classic era, but the show as a whole, and that's up to me to decide if that still really holds up. Both production and story-wise, a lot had changed from the previous series. For one, the production team moved from Clapham Junction westward to Shepperton Studios, where they would continue filming until Series 12 in 2008, which we'll get to later in the marathon. Not only that, with the first series being a financial success, the second series had a bigger budget this time around, which meant that we had sets such as Brenham Harbor, as well as Tidmouth and Crosby Stations. It even introduced many popular characters, including Duck, Diesel, Bill and Ben, Harold, Trevor, Donald and Douglas, Daisy, and Boko. Alongside the production values, the storytelling was a step up from the previous series. While the first series was simpler and focused on the characters, the second series was a bit more complex and focused on a lot of action, chases, races, runaways, and rescues. Some of the more memorable moments of the series come from episodes like A Close Shave, Old Iron, and Edward's Exploit. Even back in the 80s, Thomas and Friends was a children's show, but was never afraid to take risks such as the on-screen death of a character or having the spooky atmosphere for one of their stories. With 5 exceptions, the episodes were largely adapted from various books from the entirety of Edward the Blue Engine all the way up to the first half of Tramway Engines. Some of the books in between were later adapted for the third and fourth series, which we'll get to next time, and one more eventually being adapted for CGI in Series 20. As of 2017, only Mountain Engines and Very Old Engines have not been adapted for TV in any capacity. The aforementioned 5 exceptions were all adaptations of Christopher Awdry's stories, 3 of them coming from the 30th book of the Railway series, More About Thomas the Tank Engine. And I'm going to be perfectly honest here, Christopher's stories pale in comparison to his father's. What do I mean by that? Well, it's difficult to explain. The Sodorama Forums blog has done a post giving their insight onto the Christopher era, but to try and make a long story short, the stories come off as a bit bland, and events within happen to characters rather than them creating their own events. For example, in Percy and the Signal, the little green caterpillar with red stripes plays jokes on Gordon and James, and the big engines get their own back at him by telling him about backing signals. Pop Goes the Diesel has Duck telling Diesel to fetch his trucks for him, and in an attempt to show off, Diesel makes a complete fool of himself and vows revenge and dirty work. In Thomas Comes to Breakfast, Thomas is overconfident that thinking he can drive off on his own, but the actions of a careless cleaner prove otherwise. Meanwhile, there's The Runaway, in which Thomas returns in the works with a stiff handbrake, and then when the relief fireman forgets, Thomas becomes, well, a runaway. It's not driven by Thomas being impatient and it comes back to haunt him. It just happens to him because it does. Wilbur based the majority of his stories on real-life events and what often happened to characters in order to teach them something by the end. And that's where the criticism of Christopher's books come from. It doesn't help that many of them, especially in the 90s, featured Thomas very heavily, no doubt influenced by the TV series. On the whole, More About Thomas the Tank Engine simply feels like a filler book. No major development happening on Sodor, nor is there a new engine arriving to potentially shake up a dynamic somewhere. It's a book that just exists so Bertie and Hale could get roles in episodes like Better Late Than Never or The Runaway, and to give Thomas more roles, I reckon. Heck, Christopher hasn't spoken very kindly about the book as it had been written in a rush just to meet a deadline. Christopher's greatest strength in his writing would have to be in the annual stories like Thomas and Trevor, or standalones like Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree, both of which were adapted for this season, because they don't have to deal with major story arcs like a Railway series book does. Now, to give Christopher credit where it's due, he does write the odd good book like Really Useful Engines and Toby Trucks in Trouble, but no matter what, they'll always be in the shadow of Wilbert's writing. With Series 2, what I would have done is taken out 4 Christopher stories, Missing Christmas Tree still staying as the finale, and instead replace them with more of Wilbert's stories, which brings me on to the next point of discussion. There were pretty big plans for Series 2, but because of the 26 episode limit, a fair number of stories had to be cut. Percy's Promise and Doubleheader were both candidates, but they were instead pushed back to become part of Series 3, the latter of which was called Time for Trouble for some reason. Going Goes Foreign was another candidate, but it was cancelled altogether because it would have been incredibly expensive to produce, though it did end up being told by Mr. Perkins for Thomas's YouTube World Tour segment and got a reference in Thomas and the Royal Engine.
I know the way to London after all, and have been there before, you know. Not the station names again, Gordon. I just wish they would make up their minds on what to call London Station.
But perhaps the most infamous removal from Series 2 was the first part to Donald and Douglas's saga, The Missing Coach. During production, the model crew had gotten to the point of filming scenes at Tidmouth Station, with Thomas arriving before Bert Alcroft decided to scrap the episode altogether, citing that there was a lack of action and that the storyline would have been too confusing for younger viewers to follow. With hindsight, I would call Boiler Sludge on that, because she also adapted the Diesel, which had a similar premise with Bill and Ben, as well as a few other episodes in this series alone but didn't have much action for 4.5 minutes. Hypocrisy much? And before you get on my case, let me just say that I have a great deal of respect for Bert Alcroft in general. After all, she was the one who helped introduce Thomas to the world, and she certainly deserves her place in the franchise's history. But with all that said, and it will be brought up quite a few times this marathon, there were times when she didn't seem to understand the world that Wilbur Audrey first created. For the past decade or so, fans have been recreating how The Missing Coach might have gone had it actually been adapted for television, so I provided a few links below to provide some examples. I'll also link both parts of Nick Starman's take on its legendary status as a lost episode, and I think he can explain it way better than I could. But for all my issues with a lot of episodes being cut altogether or later readapted for the next two series, I believe that story-wise, Series 2 is about questioning the best of the classic era. I mean, it's just gem after gem. Old Iron, the Duck and Diesel trilogy, Thomas Comes to Breakfast, Edward's Exploit, Ghost Train, the list goes on and on. But I think that if you remove the adaptations from More About Thomas the Tank Engine and replace those with more of Wilbert's stories, maybe hold back Percy Takes the Plunge for Series 3, then Series 2 would probably be perfect, or at least near perfect. I even linked to you my personal take on that below. Series 2 was the last to feature Ringo Starr as the narrator, and compared to Series 1, he had a lot more energy, most likely down to the fact that he had a resurgence of popularity. By the time he had stopped drinking in 1988, this newfound popularity was forever affirmed by appearing in the first season of Shining Time Station the following year, shortly followed by renewed interest in his music career, and even at the age of 80, he's showing no signs of slowing down. Although Ringo's time with Thomas was short-lived, people speak very positively about his time with the franchise, and while in retrospect there have been other narrators after him with greater enthusiasm, he really set the tone for the show. That being said, there's a lot of debate as to who was the better narrator for the first two series, Ringo or George Carlin. Don't worry guys, I'll be talking about our modern man when we get to Series 3, and I will decide for myself who narrated Series 1 and 2 better. So overall, is Series 2 the best of the show? Well, so far we're only 2 episodes in, but right now, I'd say it is better than the first series. Anything I could say for closing thoughts, I probably already said earlier in this review, but it's going to take a lot to beat this series in terms of quality. We'll see where it goes in the future, but for now let's move on.
Do you hear that? It's the winds of change.
There's Gordon and Henry, Edward, James and Toby, Annie and Clarabelle. Don't forget Percy, Terence and Bertie, Diesel, Duck and Daisy. Lots more friends for